don't even care anymore and look rough half the time. And so today I was like actually dressed and had my hair done, and the coworker I work with the most goes, "Are you going somewhere?" And I was like, "Do I look a little different?" He was like, "Well, your hair is down, and you usually wear a black shirt when you go somewhere." And I'm like, "How do you even know this?"
Observant.
I'm like, "How do you recognize this?"
I hope that's
It
just
is very
observant.
observant. But I'm literally on the call at least 3 times a day with this person every day. And so he's literally the person I talk to the most. And so he's like, usually he'll be like, "I'm going to lunch." And if you
Well, good evening. We are so glad you've decided to join us this evening for our first panel as we go through this mental health conversation over the next 8 weeks that we're calling Don't Mention It. That, of course, comes from Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, who at one point said that anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable, it can be more manageable. And so we're talking about mental health over the next 8 weeks. I am thrilled to have with us tonight people that actually have some expertise on this conversation. We've got Morgan Lavender, who is from PR. Many of you who are from Providence Road will know Morgan. We have Kelly Saylor, and we have Mike Vaughn from Sure Hope Counseling, both of them from Sure Hope Counseling. I thought I would just let you tell a little bit about your experience, your background with counseling, whatever you want to share. We'll start with you, Mike, and just kind of work our way this way.
Okay. Hey, everybody, and those of you out there. So my name is Mike Vaughn. I went to graduate school at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary here in Charlotte and have been practicing for roughly around 20 years at this point. Do co-own Sure Hope Counseling and Training Center with Kelly. And right now, currently, my specialties are sex addiction, marriage, and trauma. So most of what I see falls into those categories, loosely based. I do intensive work and group work as well, and then some workshops. So a number of things, I guess. Yeah.
Well, we're glad to have you here, Mike.
Thanks.
What about you, Kelly?
I have been in private practice for about 10 years now, and I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified trauma specialist. So my 3 primary specialties is trauma, marriage counseling, a lot of affair recovery work, and anxiety.
Well, we're glad to have you, Kelly. What about you, Morgan? Tell us a little about your background.
So I'm also a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and I specialize primarily with children and families. Primarily kids under 10 is where I have additional training and specialty. And I've spent a significant portion doing care management, so working with people in intensive levels of care, hospitalizations, residential treatment facilities, and worked with adults and children in those locations.
Well, we're glad to have you too, Morgan. Morgan's been very helpful as we've thought through as a church, even the conversations we need to have, the order that we will cover different topics. Tonight is more of an introduction to why talk about mental health and what are we seeing with challenges with mental health in our country and our communities and some of those things. One of the things we hope out of this is that you will help us by asking questions that you may have. And so we're going to throw a number up on the screen. If at any point tonight you have a question, would you please text it to that number, 704-901-8898. That goes for those of you who are joining us online and those of you who are here in person as well. Our plan is to talk tonight from 7:15 to 8:15 and around 8 o'clock. We're going to try and take the last 15 minutes or so to answer specific questions that you may have. I'll just tell you right now, we may not get to some of your questions, and I apologize in advance for that, but we would love to hear from you. If you have an opportunity to hear from people who know what they're talking about, and hopefully you'll take advantage of that. So please text us if you have a question. I'll mention that again the closer we get to 8 o'clock as well. But I thought we'd start tonight by just talking about some of the trends that we have seen with mental health. And we can talk about COVID and how that's impacted here in a few moments. But Why do we need to have this conversation on mental health? What have we been seeing as far as trends go? What are the challenges that people are dealing with that are not being met? And so maybe Kelly, we'll start with you. Tell us just a little bit about what we're seeing with mental health across the landscape right now.
Well, I think, in the past few years with political divisiveness, COVID, all of these things, even when people have unresolved issues with anxiety or trauma, just everything has compounded in the last few years. It's trauma in the midst of a systemic trauma. So trauma on top of trauma at this point. And I think one of the main reasons we're all here today and wanting to have this conversation, I know everyone on this stage will agree with me, the sooner you get help, the easier it is to fully recover. The longer you delay, the more you listen to a stigma, it is just going to be harder. And there is such hope, and there is such recovery that can take place. So that would be the main message that we want to get across tonight.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about, you mentioned stigma, and that's a really big thing. When we think of stigma, why is it stigmatized, and what are we seeing as far as, why is mental health such a stigmatized conversation as opposed to other forms of health?
Well, even the reason I became a counselor, I remember as a child, an individual I dearly love has a chronic mental health issue. And a pastor told us that if he had things right with God, he wouldn't have mental health issues. And so in our Christian community, there is quite a stigma that if you only had enough faith or if you were really saved, you really wouldn't have these issues. And I think what we want to get across here today is that, we would never say that to a person who has cancer, or never would say that to a person who has heart issues, and to really understand the brain, and that there really is chemical imbalances that take place, and the brain needs to be cared for just like the heart, just like any other part of the body. The same creator made every single part. And so I just don't think people understand things that are seen more, and mental health is more hidden. And anytime the enemy can get us secluded or hidden in some way, shape, or form, shame will increase, and we're just less likely to come forward and be honest about what we're really dealing with.
Yeah. What would you add to that, Morgan?
I used almost a very similar analogy, so I agree with that a lot. So one of the things I would say, too, about stigma is the way it's portrayed in just communication and in media. When people who have a mental health issue or who have a substance abuse issue, it gets talked about and portrayed as something so negatively. Or it gets linked to things like violence. Or it is used, people use it as slang words, right? You have someone who very much wants to keep things orderly, and people throw out stuff like, oh, he's OCD. And so things have just become kind of this word that actually doesn't mean what is actually truly going on with someone. And I think that's just increased stigma, because if you have someone who has mental health and they hear somewhere on the media or in conversation about a joke about it, or they hear that means that always a person with mental health always means that that's someone who has violent tendencies, which is honestly not statistically the case. Those things discourage people from talking, and those things discourage people from saying, hey, I have a mental health issue, or hey, I think I need help for a mental health issue, because they're afraid of how it would be perceived moving forward, or parents are afraid of what that means for their kids and their kids' future if they were to say, hey, I think my child has something and we need to get some help, and people are afraid to kind of take that step because they don't know how it's going to be perceived by the people around them.
Yeah. Kelly mentioned or alluded to this idea of people delaying seeking mental health, and you gave a pretty alarming statistic on Sunday in our video and shared that with the staff. What was the timeline or the average for how long people wait?
Currently, the average wait is almost 11 years from the start of symptoms before people start seeking treatment.
It's just staggering. Yeah. Anything you would add about what we're seeing kind of across the landscape with challenges with mental health in our communities, in Charlotte, maybe Charlotte, or in North Carolina, South Carolina, or just across the nation?
Yeah, one of the biggest, and I spoke to this on Sunday morning, the rates in North and South Carolina of people receiving treatment are extremely low. very extremely low, some of the lowest in the country. But then in particular, the rates of youth and adolescents and kids with mental health numbers are increasing. So you have increasing numbers of kids and you have decreasing numbers of people actually getting treatment. And I would say right now, probably the largest growing area of increases in rates of both depression and anxiety, but also suicide, is in the youth population. And so I think that has just been something, even through COVID, they've looked at the risk of it, and that is a population that those numbers are just growing, and they're growing a lot faster than some of the other numbers.
Yeah, something you just said reminded me of Morgan actually sat down with our ministry staff here at PR and shared something that I think is important. When you mention suicide, there is a bit of a misnomer that some people have that to talk about it might be to plant a seed or to somehow put that idea in somebody's mind that wasn't already thinking about it. But you said that's not true. What did you say about that?
Yeah, so it's a pretty common myth that if you are talking with someone who is having suicidal thoughts, that if you actually directly ask them, are you thinking about killing yourself, that would plant a seed, and it actually usually ends up more helping the person feel like they're safe and heard and can talk through it. So most people who are having suicidal thoughts don't actually want to commit suicide. They just don't like the life that they're living right then. And so, when people are afraid to say, hey, are you actually thinking about killing yourself? Are you thinking about harming yourself? If you shut down that conversation, that person doesn't feel like the person is understanding them or listening to them. And so it's okay, and it's perfectly acceptable if someone is having suicidal thoughts to directly talk with them about it, because it allows them to say, hey, this person's actually listening to me, and then you can make a plan on how you actually can help that person.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. It's not something that I knew and actually had some hesitation about bringing that up. As how do you broach that topic? Is this something you're thinking about or have been wondering about? Mike, what are you seeing, in your practice? What's the landscape right now, the challenges we're seeing with mental health?
Yeah, I think, so we were already seeing a rise. People are talking now about the effects of COVID on anxiety and depression and things like that, but we were already seeing that rise. And I hate to bring this up, but I am a parent, so I'm going to, and that is the social media piece as well, I think has contributed to that. Technology, there are a lot of factors for this, but we were already seeing that, and so COVID has basically just really amplified that process. And so for most of us in the mental health profession now, this last 18 months has just seen such an expansion, thankfully, of those seeking help, but you kind of based on the numbers, we know for every person that is seeking help, there are many that need help and probably are not going to ask for it. And so in our practice, I know we're just seeing so many clients, and it's difficult because there aren't, frankly, enough counselors really to cover all that, which is why I think something like this is so important, because we don't need professional counselors for every situation. What we do need, though, is to be connected in community to one another, and the church is the place to start with that. And so I think that as we are all willing to be connected on important, deep levels with each other, it makes a difference just to be with each other. Just ask questions about difficult topics like suicide or others, anxiety, depression. There's things that many people are struggling with that if we can normalize that, maybe it's not quite so daunting to sit with someone.
Yeah, and you mentioned social media, so I think that's a great thing to address for a few moments. And after Mike shares some thoughts, anything you want to add, feel free. What is it about social media that is contributing, do you feel like, to some of this?
Yeah, I think there are multiple things. So there's definitely the comparison piece. It's we are, as a people, we compare ourselves. We can say all day long that we shouldn't, and we shouldn't, but we do. We're aware of what others are doing around us. I actually believe that is very much the way God created us. It's just been misapplied when it comes to social media. And so through the kind of understanding of what others around us, but even more globally, people are doing, I think that it's having a negative impact on us. It's causing us to be more anxious and more depressed because we're losing our perspective. The way God created us was to be in community with those right in our sphere, and to not necessarily, frankly, know what was going on the other side of the world, honestly. And I think sometimes with so much information that social media provides to us, it's so difficult to filter that in a consistent way. I know I certainly have struggled with that and have had to really do a lot of fasting from social media and technology in order to slow that process down, because no matter where you fall on any of the spectrums, the truth is just the amount of information alone increases our anxieties, because we were not wired, our nervous systems are not wired for that. We can't really sift and sort through that much material. We were not created to do that.
Anything you would add, Kelly?
Also, I would say in the past few years, the tone of media has changed. It's very confrontational, and just the tones, the images, the debates, they're so heightened, it's very easy to trigger things that haven't been resolved within us. And so I know pretty much if you're one of my clients, I'll always ask, will you please not watch or listen, but will you read your news? Because I have learned that small little trick right there is something that helps process a lot more of maybe some of the sadder or more traumatic news that is coming in and day out. It's just very difficult to process, and it will trigger. So that is just something that we all need to be mindful of.
I want to repeat that. Will you please not watch or listen, but read your news? I've got some family members, right? No, I'm just kidding. But there is something about that the tone, even if you're reading a transcript of what was said, that the tone that we're hearing and perceiving as we watch or listen is it plays a role for sure. You'd add anything, Morgan?
The only other thing I'd kind of build off of what they were saying about the nervous system and trauma in particular, right? Our bodies are designed to basically go into a fight-flight mode, right? That's healthy. Your body is supposed to do that. But because of trauma and because we're seeing on the media, our bodies are being tricked into staying in some of those stages longer than they should be. And when you mess with the nervous system, it ends up messing with the rest of your body. It messes with sleep, it messes with immune system, aptitude to have more illnesses, and so kind of on top of some of that, the tones, the confrontation, it's also physically changing things in your body because your nervous system is staying in a different spot than it was designed to. You're supposed to be able to, right? Animals fight and then they go back to normal. And a lot of people right now, and especially people who have a history of trauma, are staying in the fight or they're staying in the flight, and they're staying there. And that's when problems continue to develop, is when that switch doesn't turn back off and people stay in those stages. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that. And honestly, we're seeing a lot more of it because trauma is better understood now than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's also a huge shift in things too, of people recognizing what trauma is, and it's very different than what it was originally kind of conceived as and known in the public. And so as more people start to understand what trauma really is, I think a lot more people are starting to see the effects of how that has impacted so many people.
Speak a little bit more to that. Tell us about trauma.
You also have two trauma specialists over here.
We'll start with you. But if there are misconceptions about trauma, and we've learned a lot more in the last 10 years, what is it that we've learned that helps us better understand it?
I can kick it off, and then if you guys want to add, one of the biggest things is there is a perception that trauma has to be a single event. There's a perception, especially, that trauma is, if someone was abused or someone had something physically happen to them in that moment, car accident, whatever it might be, they witnessed something one event is trauma. And that is not what trauma is. Trauma is actually how your body is responding to events. So there's a lot of trauma out there that has nothing to do with a single event that can be identified in one moment in time. It's the first myth I would kick off, I guess.
I think a lot has come out about the healing of trauma, neuroplasticity, how the actual brain heals over time, and how you can actually do that in counseling. So whether you can actually see brain scans kind of before and after treatment, you can see what our brain looks like that has went through various types of trauma and actually see the healing that can take place. So I know whenever I'm working with an individual who has went through trauma, that's one of the first things I want them to see. I want them to see that a real change can take place, and a lot of research has come out in the past 10 years of how the healing of the brain actually takes place.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's helpful just to say what trauma is. So often when you talk, I will almost always ask clients when I meet them, have you had any traumatic experiences? And, for the most part, they typically say no. And then I will reframe that for them like this. I'll usually say a lot of times trauma happens, first of all, in our interpersonal relationships. We're fallen people in a fallen world. And I think one of the best definitions I know of trauma is that it often is either the presence of something that I did not need or the absence of something that I did. And so when you think of it that way, certainly not everything is trauma, definitely not. And at the same time, more things probably have impacted us negatively than what we often realize. And sometimes we're able, I think, to determine what has been traumatic for us by things that show up in our lives. Trauma usually, a lot of it occurs when we are younger because that's the developmental process and it's more impactful typically. Although, of course, there are traumas that can occur when we're older, no doubt. And I think that one of the things I'll tell clients is when you have a reaction or response in your adult life that looks a lot like a childlike response to something, that's a good indicator that it might be connected to something more significant further back in your past. And to kind of take from what Kelly said, I think that the good thing about that is as we begin to connect those dots and understand those things and God brings healing to those areas, our everyday relationships become so much healthier.
That's fascinating. A connection of if we act in childlike ways, perhaps there's a deeper connection there. So I don't know if this is the right word to describe what the last 18 months have been like, but I would think that COVID has been rather traumatic for certain groups of people or individuals. And what are we learning? What are we seeing with regard to COVID specifically, and how that has either magnified or made even more difficult some of the challenges of mental health? I'll start with you, Mike, and I know there are some pieces of this that even are causing interpersonal conflict with everything from not agreeing with relatives or friends on safety measures or where we can go or what we can do and what that looks like to just all those things. There's just a lot that's wrapped up in this. It's been so consuming for 18 months now. What are we seeing across the landscape with COVID?
Yeah, I think one of the first things is just the uncertainty, right? We have all had whatever number of our plans that didn't work because of COVID, or the uncertainty of if our kids were going to be in school the next day or in a week from now, if we were going to get sick or if we weren't, if loved ones were. So uncertainty we don't as humans deal with uncertainty very well. We like to know. And that's a little bit part of being created in God's image. But I think what COVID has really amplified in this last 18 months to 2 years is that we have lived in the midst of such uncertain times. Not just uncertainty around COVID itself, but all the ancillary things that come from that, which are the way people might react and respond to this, and so many other things. So I think uncertainty really does tap into, if we go back to trauma just for a second, really does tap into trauma. Because a lot of times one of the kind of hallmarks or bedrocks of something that's really impactful for us, really negatively impactful, is that it's something that was a really unstable, uncertain time for us, or an event. And so when we go through, like Kelly said, this systemic trauma of such a long time of not knowing, I think you're seeing that really, truly impact people at that very visceral level. So,
Kelly, you had mentioned in a previous conversation that just the idea of how do we navigate this uncertainty, and obviously that's a huge thing that manifests itself in different ways when we're not dealing well with that. But what would you say to someone that's struggling with navigating, and it's too generic, I'm sure, but in a general sense, struggling with that uncertainty?
Well, there's multiple ways. Some of the ways that come to mind is sometimes there will be benchmarks that we kind of create. You know, we might not know if your child's going to be in school next semester, but you know this child is going to be in school for at least the next 2 weeks. So let's plan for the next 2 weeks, like whatever the triggering event is for the individual, just trying to create some type of stability, even if it's stability for 1 week. And I think in the midst of this, that's definitely was a very common thing that we had to do to be able to bring some type of calmness to an individual. The other thing is just being able, with so much, like we're talking about systemic trauma, with so much sadness and uncertainty, trying to really be able to increase self-care. And I know it's a buzzword that you hear a lot of, but I've really encouraged clients, you know, even something that really took place that I was really shocked about was, you know, this is something we always work with all of our clients in, but it was shocking when a lot of my clients, all of their self-care they couldn't do anymore because they were like very extroverted and all of their options had been shut down at that point. And I was like, well, we got to start back at ground zero at this point. We got to come up with a lot of creative ways. And in a lot of uncertainty and a lot of sadness, just being able to create new ways of taking care of yourself is a way to balance out this level of stress that is impacting you day in and day out.
Morgan, I'd like you to take the lead on this next one. One of the things we hope for tonight is to give some practical ideas for how to even begin the process of seeking out help if you need help with regard to your mental health. And you brought up something last week about just even the acronyms and the initials that you'll often see when you're looking for a therapist or a counselor. And that can be really confusing to navigate. And so I think, Kelly, you mentioned licensed clinical mental health counselor. Yes.
Very good.
There you go. And then licensed marriage and family therapist.
That's
and
correct.
you see these just initials after people's names, and it all looks really good. They must know what they're talking about, but we don't even know what that means necessarily. So could you kind of give a few pointers or even some, maybe tell us what some of those are?
Sure. So it's a little bit different. Medical field, you got an MD, and it's pretty clear. But with counseling, there's lots of varieties. So a licensed clinical mental health counselor, you have a licensed marriage and family therapist, so that's LMFT. You have a licensed clinical social worker. All three of those all do therapy. They all can also do other types of things too. So licensed clinical social workers also work in what people typically might think of in a social work field or Department of Social Services, but they're licensed and they also do therapy. So we were all talking about specialty areas that we do. Every therapist also has an area that they kind of prefer usually or have specialties in. So when you're looking for a therapist, there's lots of different resources out there. I know PR has a list together of some local resources that we can provide, but Psychology Today also has a great resource of being able to drill down into different therapists, different areas. You can look at different specialties, but really making sure that someone is licensed. So there's also another one, it's a LCAS, so it's a licensed clinical addiction specialist, is also a pretty common one out there. And then you're going to see a lot of initials. Mental health is really bad about initials, so I will just say that. But you're going to see different initials for therapy. So a lot of people think of therapy as, hey, I'm just going to talk to someone. And that is not all therapy is. So there's lots of different types of therapy. And so you'll see initials for types of therapy. So you have CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy. You've got DBT, which is dialectical behavior therapy. You have EMDR, which I'll mess up the last one, but it's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. I always forget the R. So you have lots of different types of therapy. So one of the things to consider, if you have a loved one that you're looking for, you may not know what type of therapy they need, and that's okay. But one of the biggest things, if I would recommend, is you can email, you can talk, you can get information from those therapists. Who do you treat? What do you treat? Because if you yourself have depression, you probably know it's depression, and you can look for someone who works with depression a lot. Most people have little biographies or pages that have information about their specialty areas. But if you know someone has trauma, there are key ones. So EMDR is a huge one for trauma. There's DBT often out there for a lot of trauma and depression as well. So you can also look in those areas, but most people will, especially on their websites or Psychology Today, will list out specialty areas. And if they use acronyms, they're usually because it's a pretty well known. Most people don't use acronyms for, not known items, but in therapy, your biggest ones right now that you'll see are things about CBT, EMDR, DBT. A lot of those are based in working with people with depression, anxiety, trauma, and you can go from there. For little kids, you'll see things about play therapy, completely normal. That's actually recommended for little kids. Kids express language through play. So if you have a little one experiencing issues or going through issues, play therapy is another common and key one that you'll see out there, and would highly recommend for little kids.
Anything you would add, Mike?
I think that, yeah, there are a lot of acronyms. It's really ridiculous probably in some ways, but that's probably most industries. I think the main thing is that if you know kind of what you're looking for or what the issue is you want to address, read the bios, because almost all counselors at this point of various kinds are going to write something about what they do. And so you're looking for that in terms of, I think, them having that experience or that focus. And then beyond that, usually what I tell people about choosing a therapist is that it is a relationship. And so that's not going to be necessarily the first person that you go to is going to click it very well, maybe. But it's okay to ask questions in advance. It's okay to use the first session to ask questions and just get a feel for whether it's a good dynamic.
Kelly, anything you'd add to that?
I would add that Mike and I several years ago started a group. Now it's called Unify Therapists Directory, and it goes by Unify. And we started it at our seminary, and it's grown kind of statewide, and everything's free on there. But you can go in and actually search for the Christian counselors in our area, actually. So it just makes it a little bit easier too, but just in the same way as Psychology Today, but everybody that's on Unify and like Psychology Today identify themselves as a Christian counselor.
And I'm assuming some folks have sought out a counselor before, and maybe it just wasn't working, or that wasn't the right counselor. I'm assuming you would say, don't give up, keep looking. And
it's completely normal. Sometimes you click, sometimes you don't, and nothing bad about the client, nothing bad about the counselor. That's just, it's a very interpersonal type of medical treatment, and sometimes you're just going to click and sometimes you're not. So just keep the search going forward. There's plenty to choose from, and you'll find that right fit.
I know you have something to add, Morgan?
I'm going to add. So we do it all the time in medical, right? You don't like your primary care doctor, you'll find another primary care doctor. If you don't like a treatment plan with a doctor, you seek a second opinion and go to a different doctor. It's the same in mental health, because you have to have a relationship, and there are just some things that you're not going to click with someone on, and it's okay. It's just this, I don't know that I really want to share all these things with people, and that's okay. You can find someone else. You can look for someone else, because there's been so many times where I know people I have worked with or people I genuinely care about have sought a therapist and been like, I'm going to find a different one because that one didn't work. It doesn't hurt anyone's feelings. Therapy is about you making progress. Therapy is about you and your family healing and moving forward. And if it's not working, find a different therapist.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Go ahead, Mike.
And I would add, go to a therapist who has done therapy, please. It's just important.
Go to a therapist who has done therapy, him or herself, yes.
Right.
Been in therapy, him or herself, yes. So I think, Morgan, you mentioned play therapy and kids. I think we'd be remiss to not at least touch on the fact that mental health is not just a conversation that needs to be had among adults, that this is increasingly a challenge for teens and for children as well. Anything you'd want to add to that about what we're seeing with the need for children and teens, or what if you're a parent or a grandparent or you work with kids, maybe you need to be looking for as a reason to have enough concern to seek some help? Anything you'd add to that, Mike? We'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that going back to just the technology and the social media, I think in this day and age with parenting, we just have to be really, really vigilant. We have to know what's going on. We have to have difficult conversations. I don't know, in times past if we could get away with knowing less or not, but I know now we really cannot, because there are too many things. And so I think the thing that I would say, I think about that is just to be engaged. And if you're engaged, you're going to have that sense of whether things are kind of on track or if they're not. And there are a lot of resources. So we're talking about formal counseling right now, but there are a lot of resources out there by way of books and podcasts and a lot of things that you can access if you're wondering, or if you're concerned, or even if you're not, but you just want to be really aware of what's going on. So I would say the engagement level, I think, as parents today has to be really, really high.
Kelly, what would you add?
For all of my clients that are school teachers, I will add that I've heard over and over again that even teachers that have been in the industry for 20 years, that this is the hardest year they've ever had. And there's a lot to be said for systemic trauma. There's a lot to be said for individuals that are going into first, second grade that may have not been in school yet and trying to learn structure. And so I would also say just being able to support those that are taking care of our children overall, and just understanding how difficult it is to create structure when it's been so long. We know with the brain, especially when something goes past a year, it's very significant in development, and we are past a year at this point. And so not only do we need to be looking after our children and adolescents, but those that take care of our children, being very supportive and just being a listening ear for them also.
Morgan, I know with your area of focus with children and adolescents, oftentimes the way we might notice something is off, it looks different in younger people than it might look in an adult. And could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, so depression and anxiety symptoms in kids differ by age. So if you're looking at kind of youth and children, they do exhibit depression symptoms quite differently. So oftentimes teenagers who are depressed, they don't stop hanging out with their friends. So you may not notice that that's something different, but there are other things such as irritability or lack of concentration that may come about more than the fact that they're not isolated. So sometimes people think, oh, they haven't stopped spending time with their friends, but kids with depression don't always stop spending time with their friends. So there are a lot of things, there's a lot of resources online, but the symptoms just look different. So, kids who were sleeping well and now aren't sleeping well. Sometimes it's just sleep regression if they're really little, but then sometimes it could be something a little bit more. And so just being aware that, when you think of depression symptoms as an adult, that's not necessarily how your kids are going to express depressive symptoms. Same with anxiety. Kids who have anxiety, it's really clear when it's separation anxiety and they don't want to leave, but there's other forms of anxiety that really come out in forms of what often can get misdiagnosed as attention deficit hyperactivity, right? ADHD. So there's a lot of symptoms of depression and anxiety that in kids will mimic symptoms of ADHD. So just being mindful that it's not the same, but then there's also a lot of really good resources out there, because maybe a kid doesn't need formal counseling, right? Not everybody does, but there's also lots of really great books for kids. There's really great books on anxiety. There's that are kid-friendly, right? There's a What If Monster book that's out there that's really great for kids about anxiety and how to handle that. But one of the things I would also say, so there's great resources there, but schools right now, guidance counselors in the school are great resources for parents. You've got guidance counselors and in the elementary schools who are doing what's called social SES, and I don't remember the rest of the letters, sorry, social emotional something. But SES, and they're doing stuff to teach kids about feelings. They're doing stuff in the classroom about bullying. They're doing stuff in the classroom to teach kids about sharing.
I know this one. It's social emotional skills.
Skills, there you go. Clearly, I am losing words at this hour in the night. But your guidance counselors are great resources to bounce ideas off of. They're in the schools every day with kids. They see the wide range of things. So if you just have questions about it, if you have questions about what's out there or what they're teaching the kids that you could teach along with your kids in the home, they're great resources to be able to use as well.
That's very helpful. So in just a moment, we're going to ask some of your questions, and I'm going to throw that number back up there again if you missed that as we began. If you have a question you would like to ask of the experts up here, you can simply text the number 704-901-8898. Just send a text, and we'll do our best to answer in the last 15 minutes or so what those questions are. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I don't know that we have an opportunity for all of you to answer these two questions. So maybe Mike, you can answer the first question, and Kelly, you can answer the second question. Mike, the question I would ask, if there's one thing that we could say to those who are struggling with their mental health right now, but don't know where to go, don't know what to do, not sure if there's hope, not sure if there's resources, if there's just one message we could give them, what would it be?
It's that God ministers to us in so many different ways. And so formal counseling is a way, but our community is the biggest way. And so usually what I'll tell people, and I really believe this, and that is if you are struggling in any way, reach out to a person that's close to you. And hopefully most people have that. And if they don't, I think sometimes things like formal counseling can take that place for a season. But it's really important to make that an easy step. Kelly referenced shame earlier. Shame it really locks us in place. And when it comes to mental health-based things, I think it especially does. And so if anyone is struggling that is listening to us, first of all, know that we're all in this together, and we all suffer, and we all struggle. And also, I think the next step is to reach out to someone that you can connect to, because those people that are in our community are the way that we get better. Counseling is just a small part of that, but there are so many other components of that.
Yeah. Kelly, for those that are wanting to walk well with or love well on people that are struggling with their mental health, oftentimes we feel ill-equipped. We don't know what to do. We don't want to do something harmful. We know that not everything we would think to do is helpful. What would you say, any do's or don'ts, anything just as a message to those that are either needing to or just wanting to walk with somebody and love them well as they go through this struggle?
One of my favorite poems is, it's titled Outwitted. He pushed me out, heretic, rebel, a thing to flout, but love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in. And I love that poem for people who are trying to care for somebody that has a mental health issue, because a lot of times you are pushed out. And trying to find the wisdom to draw a circle to bring that person back in is a very hard thing. And I can't tell you how many people come to counseling to try to understand how to love someone well that will not come to counseling. And so I would just encourage you to get help. Depending on the disorder, you love in different ways. But there's always a way to love the person, and that's the focus. And so if you have that heart and that desire, the Lord will supply that way.
Yeah. Morgan is working on a very practical list of do's and don'ts that I cannot wait, and we will make that available when it's done. Because, as I said, there are things that just well-meaning people might say or do that are not helpful. Mention one of them that comes to mind that you shared with the staff here last week about when someone is sharing a challenge or a crisis, we often want to go quickly to reassure them that everything's going to be okay. We may even say that, but I understand that's not necessarily the best thing to say.
Yeah, I think when someone's struggling and with anything, and they tell you that they're struggling, we want to reassure someone because we want to fix it. But things aren't always fixable in that second and in that moment. So when we rush to say, oh, everything's going to be okay, it just kind of minimizes that right now it's not. And so kind of reiterating like, hey, I'm with you. Or hey, how can I help? What can I do? I get not everything's okay is also perfectly healthy. Because in that moment, for that person, it's not okay. And so we don't always have to rush. We want to rush in and we want to fix immediately, but we can't. So I think just kind of reframing it to say, I get it. What can I do? How can I walk along and support you? Is a lot more comforting to someone who's struggling in that moment than they're not really wanting you to fix it in that moment. They just want you to listen in that moment.
Also, is coming to mind, I just think it's worth sharing tonight, not promising that this conversation is always going to stay between the two of you, right? Not promising secrecy because of what may be shared that may need to be passed on or something. You want to speak to that?
Yeah, sure. There are times when something is so serious that someone else needs to be aware and it needs to be involved. And so, especially with kids, but also with adults you can help and you can support, but there are times that it may not be possible. We all are, there's terms out there of mandated reporters and things like that. But in general, you always want to promise, like, I'm here to help you and walk with you, but I wouldn't make a lot of other promises because at the end of the day, everyone's role is we want to help keep people safe and we want to keep people out of harm. And, we need to do what needs to happen to keep those people safe.
All right, we're going to get to your questions right at 8 o'clock here. So a couple of the questions we've received have to do just with the cost of counseling, and it's not always cheap. And so one of the questions is, how much does it cost to get counseling? What does that look like with insurance or Medicare? Anybody want to take a shot at that one?
What's interesting about one positive thing I would say that has took place with COVID, a lot of the state health plans, a lot of my clients paid zero, actually, all this year. Things have changed and it being completely covered. So I always encourage, usually on the back of your insurance card, there's a number you would call and say, how much would it cost for me to see an in-network provider for a mental health visit? And they will tell you if you have a deductible or if you have a copay. But like I said, a lot of the state health plans right now are completely covering the cost.
Okay, I think we're just going to do...
Can I answer one
Sure,
too?
go ahead.
There's also resources out there if you have no insurance. So there's options including sliding scales. There's community mental health providers that they receive certain funding. So if you have no insurance, there are also options available, and you can usually start to type that in no matter what state you live in, because there are community health clinics. So if you don't have, there's also a word called underinsured, that there's resources available too. So I would not let, what I would like to say is I would not let cost be the driver of not seeking treatment.
Okay, next question. Is mental health or mental illness hereditary? Mike, you want to take a swing at that?
Yes and no. So yes, it is. So I think mental health oversimplifies probably what is going on. As you said on Sunday, we are holistic integrated beings, and so absolutely there's a genetic component at times to mental health issues. That's, I think, long been established, and so you see those patterns in families, and we just know more and more, although we certainly don't know a lot still yet, that there are genetics that play a factor in that, and then sometimes not. Sometimes it's externally based, it's circumstantially based, or otherwise.
Okay, next one. Is it true that if a student commits suicide, other students in a school are more likely to attempt suicide? Want to take that one, Morgan?
I gotta think of my answer. Can I say yes and no? So there is some truth that there are sometimes suicide numbers that rise. Some of it is due to notification and people realizing and speaking out. It is not a cause and effect, though. So one student suicide does not mean that there will be others. So I would start there because it is a yes and no. There are some statistics that show the more it is publicized and in media, that it can increase numbers, but it also is drawing an awareness to it. So it's it's hard to give a very short answer on that question. I don't know,
I know there was some panic, was a couple of years ago when the show 13 Reasons Why came out, and is this glorifying suicide? Is it planting the idea? Whatever the case may be, but anything you would want to add?
I do think it can be influential, right? Because especially adolescents, all of us are influenced by those around us. Adolescents particularly are, just because of the developmental process. And so I do think that as they see things around them like that, it can influence. The cause and effect piece is where it gets a little bit tricky, yeah.
Kelly, anything to add?
A few years ago, sometimes we see trends that happen with adolescents. And a few years ago, there was like cutting packs, like friends that would get in groups and all cut together. And so I would say there is enough evidence to say if there is a suicide in the school, you definitely need to take account of all the close friendships of that individual, because obviously it's traumatic to the very least, but just to make sure that there is not any type of influence that goes forward.
Mike, you mentioned sex addiction, I think, as one of your areas of specialty, so maybe this would be a good question for you. Is sex addiction a new problem? And then there are a couple other follow-up questions, which are drugs usually related to that? Is it helpful toward normalization to have a partner or a spouse who is equally addicted?
Let's take these one at a time.
Okay.
By
First
the-
one is it...
By the way, when I share that I do sex addiction work, it tends to shut things down. So that's the first question. What was the first question?
Is it a new problem?
No. I think we have a new awareness of it. We have new labels for it in some ways. There is some debate about it being quote unquote new. I think even if you look in the Bible, it's pretty clear that we have had sex addiction as an issue for a very, very long time. I don't personally believe it's new. Thankfully, I think we're more aware of it than we used to be. We now have different treatments for it, and so I would add that part, but I don't think it's new.
Yeah. The other question, is it helpful toward normalization to have a partner or a spouse who is equally addicted? I'm
not sure what that question is. I don't know.
That's okay. I mean,
Yeah.
it's stuff we can't really ask
Yeah.
in real time with these being text messages.
I will say that, one of the reasons that I do sex addiction work is that it's extremely, of course, destructive. And at the same time, for people in recovery from any addiction, I've also seen some amazing ways that God works in that, and just the redemption that happens in relationships as a result.
And with the question about drug abuse, if that is associated.
Yes, and I see now there's a follow-up to that.
Okay.
For instance, illegal drugs, meth, cannabis, and the like. Is that related?
I personally work mainly with sex addiction in the context of when an individual has either finished or in a better place in treatment, like with a person like Mike, more with the restoration of the marriage. And statistically, in my clients, there has been no drugs involved. What is more seen is there has been trauma involved, a lot of unprocessed, unhealed trauma that has took place. So that is more of the commonality that I have seen.
Okay, this is not related to the last question. Just a very simple one, though. Does walking help when we're talking about our mental health?
Yes. In fact, there's just really so much fascinating research now around our physical health and our mental health and, of course, our spiritual health. And so I would say that walking is really, really good. Walking, actually, the rhythm of the footfall of walking is very calming to the body. And so we haven't talked about this yet, but like in the midst of COVID and so much uncertainty and our nervous systems being so messed up, one of the best things that you can do, of course, is exercise, but sometimes people get hung up there, and so I'll typically say, and this is true for me too, get out in your neighborhood or a park and walk, and you'll be amazed at how much calmer your body feels. Just doing that as much as you possibly can is very literally and figuratively grounding to the body, so it helps immensely.
And 30 minutes of cardio will act as a mild antidepressant in the brain. So it's very, very significant for multiple reasons.
Yeah. One more question. It says that Morgan mentioned that the data of adult therapy has reduced while child therapy has risen. Does that sound right?
Not really reduced, but the incidence of depression and anxiety in children have significantly risen faster than adults.
Okay.
Adults has not decreased.
So the follow-up questions to that were, is there a reason why? And do you think kids are reacting to their parents' issues that are not being dealt with?
Yes, to that one.
Okay.
Yes, kids pick up everything. So if adults have mental health issues or unprocessed trauma or increased just normal stress, right? Because there's also just increased stress from human life. Kids pick up on it and they absorb it, and they often can't deal with it the same way an adult can. We can say, hey, we know we're stressed because work is more busy, we have, X number of Zoom meetings, or we have, we don't know if we're going in the office or back, and there's all of those just daily stressors that are life. So when you add on mental health on top of that, kids don't have the same way to process to say, hey, everyone in my household is stressed, but that's them, that's not happening to me. All they see is the franticness, and they absorb it, and they don't know how to process it and get it out, and so they do tend to pick up on that a lot quicker, and it's harder for them to navigate through it.
Okay. Anything you'd add?
Amen.
Amen. There we go. This one I think relates to a little bit of confusion around the initials, the acronyms, and all of that. And so I think this is a question for you three, and then you can speak to, I believe I know the answer to this question, but then you can speak to where they might go if they need this. Can you prescribe prescriptions, is what this question asks.
Yeah, that's a good question. We actually get that too. No, we cannot. We are not doctors in that sense. Some have PhDs, so they're doctoral level at that level, but absolutely do not prescribe medicine. That would be a psychiatrist. And sometimes people get psychiatrists and psychologists confused. Psychologists typically have they have doctoral degrees, but not MDs. Those would be the psychiatrists. And psychiatrists and PAs are the only ones that can prescribe well. Nurse practitioners can too. But basically, those with very, very defined medical degrees, yeah.
Great
Just
question.
to add to that, though, counselors do often work in combination, and it's best when they can communicate and work together. So if you're working with a counselor and they may have someone, if you don't have someone that can prescribe medications, and that's something that's needed, because it's not always needed, but they can usually work, and it's better when both parties know that they're working with each other. You just heal a lot more when everyone's kind of working together, and that can be done.
Yeah, so we have time for one more, and I want to follow up with that. There is this vague gray area I think people struggle with sometimes of going, do I need counseling or do I need medication? And either or a combination of both. What would you say to that as you try to help someone navigate that? Maybe we'll start with you, Sailor I told you I was going to do it. I have a niece named Sailor.
You
Kelly
almost made
Sailor.
it.
And I said I would answer.
3 minutes out.
You can call me Sailor.
Yeah, but navigating the question of medication versus or in tandem with counseling,
Yes.
some of that.
And research does show that the combination of the two work the most effectively, but you shouldn't know the answer to that. I would say, and it's a very complex question and answer, so just get with your counselor and you two will start assessing that and seeing, okay, is movement taking place with these techniques? Can we even put these techniques in place? Do we need the medication to be able to take that next step and being able to practice this technique? And your counselor will walk with you to help you navigate. if a psychiatrist is needed. And then, as Morgan did an excellent job explaining, you get a signed release between your counselor and your psychiatrist, and they will work in tandem to best find the combination that works.
And I would add, couples generally wait 6 years too long before they enter counseling. And so this follows what Morgan was talking about earlier, just a different statistic. And so kind of to the question of, do I need counseling or do I not? Should I go or should I not? I usually say most people skew towards waiting too long. I think we probably do that as people with many things. And so if you're already asking the question, should I or do I, that means you're probably some time past, yes, I do. And so it would be good to do that. Is usually what I tell people. Certainly I have friends and things like that will ask me about certain situations and should I either take my child or do you think I should go? And most often my response to them in hearing what's going on is that yes, you should, and sometimes it's not. So it's not a blanket thing, but just as a people, we tend to wait too long. And so I think when it comes to our awareness that, oh gosh, this might be a really significant problem, I wonder if I should get counseling, it typically means yes, you should.
That's a great word to end on, and I want to thank you all so much for being here, Mike and Kelly and Morgan. This has just been invaluable, and I know this is just the beginning of our conversation over the next 8 weeks, and starting next week, we're actually going to dive in a little deeper on specific topics. Next week, we'll be talking about anxiety, and we'll have a couple of, Morgan will be back with us, I believe, and we'll have a couple of other mental health professionals in the area. We have Hannah Booker, who specializes in child therapy and play therapy, I believe, and also Jonathan Hereditary as well, and we will talk about and really dig in on this problem of anxiety that so many of us are trying to wrestle through and navigate. But thank you all so much for showing up tonight and for having this conversation with us. I want to mention that both Kelly and Mike, again, that they work at Sure Hope Counseling. That's their practice. If you want to look them up online, there's a number of counselors also that you work with over there. And just an invaluable resource. And thank you so much for joining us in person and online tonight. And we will be continuing to answer questions throughout this series. We'll throw that number back up there each week, and would love to hear from you what questions you have. But thank you so much for joining us, and that is going to conclude our panel this evening.